Good morning. It's 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and then all of you gather here at a webinar somewhere online in the world, coming from either Indonesia, South Africa, Norway, or the other parts from the US, where it's probably very late at night. So it's good to have you all here. Thank you very much for joining. My name is Ulrich Saldesacht. I'm dialing in from Belgium. Our headquarters is LSEC here in Leuven today. We are continuing with the sixth of our webinar series with cybersecurity experts from home. And today, again, like every second Tuesday, we talk about the challenges and developments in relation to cybersecurity for 5G. So we see developments of 5G happening all over the world. They are being deployed quite heavily as we speak, and I think that's definitely a positive thing. But I think it's also good to spend a couple of moments in understanding how the world is actually developing when it comes to security by itself. So I'll share a couple of thoughts on this. As we know, 5G deploying very heavily, but a couple of years ago, ENISA has been doing a bit of a study on what 5G should be also worrying people about when it comes to 5G deployments. So this was from a study from 2018. In the meantime, additional ideas and thoughts have been found. Before that, other types of vulnerabilities have been found as well. But as an overall perspective, we can see that there are and continue to be some major flaws in telecom, which are also still applicable in 5G when 5G is going to be retrograde usage. That means that from the 5G network, you would also be able to still use 4G, 3G, 2.5 and 2G, at least not only for data communication, but definitely also for voice communication. So here we can see that there's still quite a lot of flaws happening throughout. And so one of the topics that we will be addressing today are some of those different challenges. On the other hand, we know that 5G has quite a lot to offer when it comes to security. So this is a bit of the perspective that we have been talking about previously in some of the debates. And that we'll go into slightly more into the webinar in 2 weeks' time. But just a couple of ideas. So 5G is about virtualization, is about software-defined networking, is about cloud operations, and definitely also about connecting things and preferentially many different things. So those are a couple of the very strong benefits that 5G brings along, of course, next to the benefit of quite a lot of speed improvements. Then in terms of the concept of slicing and dicing, it would actually mean that for companies that would like to apply 5G as an enterprise, they can consider working together with the mobile operators to have their own virtual private networks on top of the public 5G architecture. So those things are available from a technology perspective, but it also means that we would expect some of those different technologies and concepts to be deployed already early on. So it has been considered from 5GPP that will be happening in different phases. So phase one would be the different elements, as you can see here. So quite a number of interesting additional security features being added to the overall perspective of cybersecurity when it comes to 5G. So the number of functionalities in 5G are definitely there. That is something that we know. But we still have to worry about, of course, what the core functionalities are, and of course also what some of the background challenges are when it comes to cybersecurity. And those topics we will be addressing today in this webinar, together with Koen Claesen from Huawei, and together with Francois Zamora from Orange, two speakers that have been participating in the previous discussions as well. So maybe a couple of words about LSEC before I hand over the word to Koen and Francois. So LSEC is a not-for-profit association. We are an association of IT security companies in the first place, companies providing technologies and doing system integration and providing services advisory for cybersecurity. But at the same time, we bring together about 15,000 end users that have an interest in using cybersecurity. So with these webinars, we provide some awareness activities like we've done before in our face-to-face events, and now like we will continue to do also with documentation, with video materials, and with all sorts of different white papers. What we are working towards is thinking about how the world is changing, what innovations are impacting the industry that we're living in and the world that we're living in. And that means in the first place, of course, also looking into innovations like 5G, but also things like robotics, also things like IoT, and definitely also how the world is impacting us today in the current situation that we're in, being released from the lockdown under COVID-19, and just understanding what that really means for all of us. So I hope in the next 55 minutes to an hour, we'll get some more insights on how Europe and the member states are considering the use of deployment of 5G when it comes to security, and what requirements the member states have been thinking of. And we'll do that in an interactive session in the first place with Koen. Koen, are you there?
Yes, I am.
And then also with Francois. And Francois is he's dialing in from his garden. I've seen earlier this morning. So Francois, how is the weather there in France? Where are you dialing in from?
Actually, I'm west of Paris, and weather is lovely. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so you're being released from your lockdown situation as well, as it seems, and yeah, luckily under the nice blue sky in Paris. So we probably won't be able to make it to Paris today, so it's good that we have a bit of your perspective. So Koen, handing over the word to you. Please share with us your views and topics, and good morning, of course, also to you.
Okay, thank you, Ulrich, and good morning, everyone. Let me just start with sharing here. And meanwhile, let me introduce myself. I'm a member of Brussels Security Center at Huawei, and I will try to explain to you today what Huawei's approach is towards all the activities that have been happening throughout Europe and from the European Commission with regards to toolbox and risk assessments and everything. And I'll explain how we try to approach this. So without further ado, let's start. First of all, maybe a little bit of a level set. I don't know how much you guys know about all the activities that have been happening in 5G. They've been widely publicized, obviously. So just let me recap maybe in a couple of minutes. The last year has been very, very active, obviously, in terms of 5G and what the European member states and the Commission have done. Beginning of last year, the Commission was asking all the member states to come up with a risk assessment, a national risk assessment in terms of 5G. Where did all the member states see the risks pertaining to 5G? What did they perceive to be? In October, all the risk assessments, the national risk assessments, were consolidated by ENISA and NICG, and they published an EU risk assessment report. That was a very, very interesting report to us. We closely followed it, obviously, because that gave us a view as to how Europe was perceiving all the risks pertaining to 5G. And then a little bit later on, beginning of this year, it was scheduled the end of last year, but had a little bit of delay. They came up with a toolbox, as they mentioned it. And the toolbox is actually a whole list of potential requirements or tools that you could use in order to improve the security of your 5G ecosystem and your security ecosystem. We're now, you see, a little bit over the April 30th date. That has been shifted also a little bit due to COVID and some other things. And we're very close to the member states implementing key measures identified in the toolbox, and also reporting up to the EU Commission as to what their progress is, what their individual progress is. So that's more or less where we're at. So just going into a little bit further into the toolbox, because that's obviously the most important artifact that was released by Europe. The toolbox consists of it's actually a very decent document. It's obviously a consensus document from 26, 27 member states, but it consists of strategic measures, a set of strategic measures, which are not immensely technical. So it talks about regulatory powers, how you need to address third-party suppliers, diversification of suppliers and the need thereof. And the technical measures go into a little bit more detail on what baselines to use, which technical measures to focus on, how to create resiliency and continuity. And then there's also a list of supporting actions that are helping to create these strategic, or to comply to these strategic and technical measures. So that's a little bit the outline of the whole security toolbox. Now, maybe if I can step back a little bit, when the risk assessment came out, then obviously you can imagine for Huawei this was very important, because throughout all the communications and everything that happened last year, we very much were interested to see what the concerted EU approach was. So with a couple of experts internally also, before the toolbox came out, and after the risk assessment was published, we analyzed that risk assessment and we came out with our own position paper to do a little bit of a thought exercise, to say like, okay, if these are all the risks that Europe is seeing, how would we as a company address these risks? Which best practices would we suggest to actually mitigate these risks? And on a higher level, let's try to be vendor agnostic as possible. How would we recommend our customers to actually comply or mitigate the risks outlined in the risk assessment? So needless to say, we released that last year, the end of last year. So needless to say, when the toolbox came out, we were a bit anxious to see if we were thinking in the same direction. But luckily, so we were actually we were very aligned with the thoughts of what was described in the toolbox. Here you see a whole list of the technical measures that were listed in the toolbox, and it maps more or less, well, in various ways. It maps to all the different sections that we've outlined in our position paper. So that was quite reassuring that we were thinking in the same direction. Now, moving into the toolbox a little bit, it's a very good document, and there's a couple of things that we wanted to mention here. First of all, there's a distinction between strategic measures and technical measures, and we obviously we support all the measures that are in there. There's maybe a couple of things that are important to say. First of all, the strategic measures typically have a fairly big economic impact. It's also as stated in the toolbox. So that's something that anybody that is applying all these measures should take into careful consideration. We do support a lot of the lists, and I'll highlight a couple of things. A lot of the things that are outlined here. For example, a unified 5G security evaluation is being called for, and unified certification standards. I think throughout the industry, throughout the telco industry, that is something that everybody's, vendors and operators alike, will applaud, because the fragmentation of the certification efforts or the different certifications is something of a nuisance to our customers and to our friend competitors and ourselves. We also recommend the fact that the right to choose 5G suppliers is something actually that should belong to the operators, with the oversight of the strict regulations and the audits of regulations, but it should belong to the operators. We also do fully support the multi-vendor approach, and as you see, that's also one of the strategic measures. It's completely sensible to have actually a multi-vendor approach, also from a security perspective. We're not big fans of putting any quantitative caps on market share or bans of a particular product domain, but the whole, from a holistic perspective, a multi-vendor approach makes absolute sense. And last but not least, and this is obviously very much pertaining to us, as you can hear in the media. There's a big section on the fact that the risk profile of specific vendors needs to be assessed, and while we don't have any problem with that fact, we would recommend that this should be based on facts and follow consistent principles in a fair and a transparent manner. Obviously, we should be subjected to specific rules and regulations, but we recommend that this has been done in a transparent way so that everybody knows how you come to a specific result of an assessment. And lastly, we very much welcome the idea of a collaboration across industry between the operators, the vendors, and the government instances, also regulators, to come up with a full holistic 5G end-to-end ecosystem or secure ecosystem. Now, talking a little bit about the risk profile, if you read the risk assessment, the EU's risk assessment that was published in October, then it defines a couple of parameters on which you can actually assess the vendor's risk profile. And that goes from ownership transparency to the ability to assure supply, to product quality. There's also a section on third country legislation, and the ability to exercise pressure, including in relation to the place of manufacturing of the equipment. So those are literal copies of the risk assessment. And if we go down this list one by one, we don't feel we pose any higher risk compared to any other vendors, and especially due to the international nature of the supply chain of all manufacturers. So if you'll allow me, I'll go into a little bit more detail on all of these points. First of all, and this is something, I don't know, this is something of a point of confusion apparently across the world, what the ownership structure of Huawei is. And I'm actually, well, I used to be a security officer at Proximus and some other things, but I wasn't aware of this either before I came into Huawei. This is a not very well known fact in my mind. The fact that Huawei is completely 100% employee owned. So there's no state ownership or anything in the whole Huawei ownership structure. This has also been audited by third-party companies like KPMG, and they corroborate these statements. So this is actually fairly unique, and it's quite logical that that it sometimes is a cause for confusion, because this is a very unique structure, not only in the world, but also in China itself. This is not a very typical Chinese model. This is a model that was created in the Shenzhen and in the southern area economic zone in order for Chinese companies to be better equipped to compete with foreign companies. But the main points here to take away is that it is not part of any government, not part of any financial institution or consortium. That also allows us, since we are 100% held by employees, it allows us to be very flexible and not be too subjected to market pressures, to the pressures of investors or anything else. That was one of the reasons why our founder said that we can maintain a very decent level of level of investment into R&D. So over 15% of our total revenue goes to R&D, and we do not sway from that. And we're also not being swayed by any of the investors or outside influences to cut investments on R&D. So that's something that is very powerful. Secondly, and this is something that we're getting a lot of accusations in terms of special funding facilities for Huawei's businesses. I've attached here a PDF that goes a little bit more into detail, and I'm very happy to share it. A couple of points to note is, first of all, the direct grants that Huawei has received from the Chinese government just make up 0.3% of the total sales of, for example, 2009 to 2018. And not only that, those type of grants, or the types of grants that Huawei has received, is not unique to Huawei. They're also available for any foreign invested companies in China if you meet the same qualifications. for those types of grants. Secondly, most of the loans that Huawei has received are from foreign banks, so it's not so that they're all privileged type of loans from Chinese government or something. The vast majority of the loans are actually loans on standard commercial terms from foreign banks. And lastly, there's also our tax rate that we're paying. And again, it's 15% or around 15% is very similar to the rate that is being paid by, for example, US companies. Second point is the whole legislation. And the legislation is a bit of is something that keeps coming back, and it's a little bit of a difficult one. First of all, we had the Chinese legislation, or there were a couple of external companies that were also auditing the legislation, Chinese legislation, to see how much impact it has on Huawei and Huawei's operations in, for example, Europe. It has been done by Ernst & Young, and it has been done by Clifford Chance. They've looked at all the different laws in China that could potentially have or stoke the idea of Huawei having to cooperate with any request to the Chinese government. Of all the laws that have been investigated, they came to the conclusion that at no point Huawei, as an infrastructure vendor, is obligated to cooperate with any type of Chinese government request if it should come. So, in terms of surveillance or pulling data from our customers, and that's the first assessment. And the second assessment, I think, was even more interesting. Simmons, and again, this is a publicly available report, has done a comparative analysis of a lot of governmental access and assistance laws throughout the world. And here's a couple of the most interesting and most relevant countries for us. And you'll find that the access and assistance laws that are in the Chinese legislation are not much different from the ones we know, or the big countries we know. Maybe with one ironic contrast, that the Chinese legislation does not have any extraterritorial effect explicitly stated, whereas that does happen in some other countries that we know very well. And you know, a couple of international or specific national laws that are that do have an extraterritorial effect, like, for example, our beloved GDPR, or there's a couple of laws in the States, like the FISA Act and the Cloud Act, that also have extraterritorial effects. The other point is the ability to assure supply. We do have, as a company, a very solid and multi-source supply strategy, and that spans different areas. So from an R&D perspective, we do have the capability of, we set up a BCM system that allows us to use multiple technologies. From a procurement perspective, we can choose out of multiple suppliers. So always, for any type of component, Huawei has a primary supplier, but they are continuously subjected to security audits. Once they start failing security audits, or they score low in security audits, backup suppliers kick in. And that's not only for security, that's obviously also for any other type of quality assurance that cannot be met by these suppliers. On production facilities, we have production facilities in many different regions, as you can see here, in Hungary, in Mexico, in Brazil, and in India. And also the supply chain is diversified across the world. Now, and I think I mentioned it before already, you do have a global supply chain, and there's a global footprint of all the suppliers' manufacturing plants. I don't claim to be here completely exhaustive. This is public information, but you see that all the main 5G manufacturers have operation manufacturing plants across the world. Also, all three also in China, but also in the other parts of the world. Granted, there's a couple that are planned here, but this should give you an idea the global nature of the supply chain and even of the places of the manufacturing plants. And as everybody well knows, no vendor, not Huawei, but not anybody else, is immune to supply chain threats, be it supply chain threats in types of mistakes or in active exploitation of the supply chain. We've all seen these examples; these are not new, and that's one of the reasons why we actually suggest a zero trust approach. But not only a zero trust approach is a very well known term in the IT security architecture world. Not only from that perspective, but also from a supplier management perspective. Everybody is dependent on a global supply chain. You can't just cut out one country out of that supply chain and excluding one company based upon where their headquarters are nationally based is not really addressing a specific risk. Secondly, and that talks to the technical architecture perspective. If you have a fully interconnected world, and as many of you know, in the telco world is moving closer and closer into the IT world from a technical perspective. We're setting up services in cloud infrastructures. A lot of these services are being exposed to the internet by way of APIs. So you feel that. And this is happening already for 10 years, I think, and in the previous 4G and 3G as well. But you feel that more and more, and now even more, parameter controls only are not sufficient. So there is a zero trust approach and a defense in depth approach that you need to take from an IT security perspective. For going back to the supplier management, how do you adopt a zero trust approach? There's a couple of things that should definitely be included. For example, and this is also stated in the toolboxes and in the other publications of the EU, is there need to be, and we absolutely favor it, there need to be strict controls around supplier access. If a supplier for any reason has certain access to an operator's network, that should be governed very tightly. Everything that happens needs to be authorized, and it needs to be able to audit. You need to be able to audit. So that architecture needs to be set up in a very strict way. We also advocate security verification through continuous testing, auditing of the processes of the suppliers' security development processes, for example, but also testing of the products by way, or be it through by our customers or by other bodies. And we actually welcome any of our stakeholders to do the security verification, as you know, up till the source code validation. And the Brussels Center is one of the centers where I'm in right now, is one of the centers that provides this capability for all our stakeholders. Supply chain traceability is a big one as well. If any mistakes should arise, you need to be able to trace that back to specific actions or development actions, and so you can take appropriate mitigating actions. Also, whenever you deliver a product or whenever you build a product, you want to make sure that obviously it's been delivered to your customer in an untampered way. So all these things can actually help implementing a zero trust approach in terms of supplier management. Lastly, you have the defense in depth architecture, and that goes more into the technical parts of it. And there's a couple of statements that should feel very familiar. Like, for example, that mandatory strong authentication of all components in a 5G ecosystem. That is immensely important now. You shouldn't just trust, obviously, your firewalls. Every component talking to another component should be authorized to talk to that specific component. And the great thing is that 5G service-based architecture caters actually very well for this type of these types of measures. We also promote strong encryption, system hardening. Obviously, the network still needs to be segmented, so firewalls are not going away. It's just one part of the big puzzle. And last but definitely not least, is the need for pervasive security monitoring. I believe that especially in 5G with the integration of so many different players into that ecosystem, it becomes all the more important to have a pervasive security monitoring and have an end-to-end view of all the traffic flows that are happening throughout or across your 5G infrastructure. So all in all, and you also feel it, and it's been stated time and time again in the EU publications. 5G is a shared responsibility. It happens. Everybody has its responsibilities. We as a vendor, and I'm sure the other vendors as well, we gladly take our responsibility in terms of hardening our equipment and delivering equipment that is built in a secure way. But obviously, the operators that are purchasing that equipment and that infrastructure need to configure them correctly. And then you have the service providers on top of it that are running on top of the infrastructure that the operators are offering. If anybody fails in security, the whole ecosystem is impacted. So it's very important that we all work together. And in the threat landscape document of the EU, it was also very explicitly stated in the conclusions that we need to collaborate all together in order to come to a secure 5G ecosystem. Now, a couple of things. We do feel that Europe is going in the right direction. Here's a couple of evolutions and statements from across Europe, and we do feel that most of the European countries are taking a fact-based approach towards that toolbox, and for us then towards our company. So that's very reassuring. One of the approaches that we very much favor is, for example, the Germany approach, where they actually set up or where they list a whole list of requirements that security requirements that are aiming to improve or to guarantee a specific level of security, not excluding any type of player, but setting an objective set or an objective list of security requirements. And for the critical components of that network, any type of vendor will have to go through a certification process. We believe we are very well placed to actually collaborate with the German government instances, as we've set up a lab already 2 years ago in Germany to work with the PSI to improve security standards and to work on security innovation. Now, the last couple of words on certification, and I think anybody in the industry will corroborate that. There's a big need for a unified way of certifying a specific level of security. We know there's a CC certifications with the EAL levels. At this moment, the 5G RAN has undergone the tests in Spain, and we're well on track to get the EAL4 certification. Tests have actually been finalized and results have been communicated. You only need the certification to be published now. That's CC, but CC is obviously very IT focused. NESAS and SCAS standards were standards that are created by GSMA and was an industry effort. Along with the operators and all the vendors, we've come to realize that there was a need for a unified standard, and NESAS with the security assurance schemes and in collaboration with 3GPP, the standards organization, is actually coming to a decent level of security assurance. Which is being agreed to by the whole industry. And I'm actually happy to mention that Huawei is one of the first that is undergoing that NESAS compliance. And we have successfully, just 2 months ago or 1.5 months ago, we had this report. We have successfully passed the first part of a NESAS audit, which means that we successfully reported 100% compliance on our product development procedures for the 4G and 5G RAN product lines. So that's pretty good news for us. And also, and this is the last news, is that as you know, I'm working in the Security Transparency Center, and we allow for our stakeholders to verify the security of the source code that we have that we built. UNW is a German pen testing, a reputable German pen testing company, also the organizers of a big security conference called Troopers in Heidelberg, and they have done some tests on 5G's UDG product, Huawei's 5G's UDG product. That's actually about the UPF components, and concluded that the source code is of good quality. And there's a public version of that document, of that report, that we'll gladly share. It went over 3 big areas: source code quality, build process, and the open source lifecycle management, and all were deemed to be in good shape and fairly state of the art. And this also covers a couple of the sticky points, like binary equivalence, the use of secure compilation options, or the open source lifecycle management, the use of any type of open source components that should be updated. So those are very encouraging evolutions for us. So all in all, a couple of things that I want you to walk away from to take away is, first of all, that EU is taking a fact-based approach, and this is something that we can only welcome. And Huawei as a company and as a vendor will definitely commit to comply to all its measures. And this is one of the most important ones. We definitely applaud EU's effort to come up with a unified EU security assurance scheme, and all the work that ENISA is doing, and will enthusiastically follow that certification once it becomes available. We do recommend adopting a zero trust model in terms of supplier management, especially in view of the characteristics of a global supply chain of all the manufacturers. Germany is a great example of a fact-based approach in terms of what they've done so far. And I think we can conclude that all the network elements typically are managed by telecom operators, and cybersecurity thereof can also be managed by the operators. Granted, with defined strict regulation and oversights of the regulators, but we do believe that all the risks can be adequately mitigated by implementing the proper technical and procedural controls. And with that, I'm going to end my monologue and see if there's any questions. Or Francois, Francois, is there anything you want to add?
Sure. First of all, you said quite like 95% of the key messages, and on which we fully agree. And thanks a lot for this excellent presentation. Let's make a place for the questions, and then I will add my 2 cents of observations there.
Right. So, Francois, maybe you can. Yeah. Now we have you back on the screen as well. We don't yet have any questions coming from the audience. There's a couple of things here. Harpreet is suggesting now as we speak. Can you please explain in short again the zero-touch policy? Is it for vendors to make better control over them?
Certainly. So the zero trust approach, and it's a bit of a phrase that is coined, but the most important thing on the zero trust approach is where it comes from. If you look at the global nature of the whole supply chain of everybody, I mean, everybody has parts made in China, made in America, made in Europe. Everybody has Chinese, European, Indian, American employees. So based upon these facts, we promote the idea of a zero trust approach for supplier management, which means that all the suppliers should be held and should be subjected to a specific set of strict controls that at every stage of and at different stages. First of all, you need to be transparent as to what you are as a supplier, how you develop your products. Secondly, you can offer the capabilities to actually, and I'll go back on the slide because that may help. The capability to do the source code testing. That's another thing which is very important. We try to be as transparent as possible about this. But also, once you have sold specific infrastructures, how do you maintain that relationship with a vendor? If the vendor at any point needs to come in and to do specific activities, it's not necessary, but if they're invited to do certain actions on the infrastructure that has been already deployed, it needs to be it needs to be happening in a very, very controlled fashion. So those are a couple of the tenets that we believe are part of the zero trust approach in terms of supplier management.
So I guess in the relation of, yeah, I think it's there's a bit of a follow-up reaction from Harpreet. So let me just quickly see what he has been writing about in a case. Yeah. So why only Huawei, which is facing a lot of differences from with federals? I mean, why is it untrusted? Are there any other vendors too which are facing challenges? So I guess there are. So in terms of the zero trust, I think it's applicable definitely to all the different vendors to some extent. The question is, of course, how can you prove the zero trust component? The question is not only whether you can prove it, the question is also, do you really need to prove it, the zero trust capabilities? So there's, I think, the idea about zero trust is, of course, something that has been going around for many years. We try to apply it in many different aspects and industries, but the question is really, how can you prove?
Yeah, I don't think it's
if I may,
so much
if I may step in here, the zero trust approach is an approach where you're considering every possibility of risk scenario, and as a consequence of that, you are considering every security control on a systematic way. The change given with the complexity of 5G, and you probably noticed in the slides related to the EU toolbox, some of the measures apply to the member states' security agencies. Others apply to telecom operators. Others applies to the equipment vendors. And tomorrow they will apply to a slice consumer. And the zero trust approach is not only relying on the sole vendor precaution and all the care he puts on the life cycle of the product. It also relies on the fact that in the ecosystem of the 5G network, you're going to have stakeholders that are going to proactively monitor the effectiveness of the risk scenario mitigation in real conditions of production. And once you understand that, you are starting to consider that not only the certification of products, the OS hardening, configuration, source code quality will not only the big pillars of this trust. The second pillar, the other family of pillars, are going to be security monitoring on orchestration, automation, hypervisor behavior, BSS, OSS, and all operational tasks that are entering into the ecosystem of the 5G network operations. And tomorrow, we also have a set of trust requirements that will address the slice consumers and the verticals using computer age. So you need to understand that the zero trust approach is not only relying on a duty that relies on the vendor, but it's a duty that relies on all the ecosystem, and each and every part of the ecosystem will need to consider putting a proactive detection of risk scenario identified in advance, but also a self-improving loop where you always tune up the relevance of your detection sensor. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Francois. Koen, did you want to, yeah, so many thanks do we get from Harpreet. So did you want to add anything to this, Koen?
No, I think Francois said it very well. Maybe just the one thing is the zero trust approach. It's an approach. It's a philosophy how you meet certain risks. it's not something you prove. I think there's definitely a couple of things that are part of this, but I think as a whole, it's not something you prove. It's something you strive for, and you put a lot of requirements and sets and mitigations in place in order to come to a zero trust model, which is a multi-layered model in terms of security.
Okay, so I think it's now 9:45, and Francois indicated that he needed to start going. So maybe before you really are going, Francois, what we've seen is really a very strong pitch, of course, from Huawei here, trying to present their best efforts in everything when it comes to cybersecurity, to make, of course, a very transparent perspective of what they're offering. You're, of course, in the spotlight here when it comes to, is this all true? I mean, how much of this can we relate to back? Because in essence, there's of course the confusing message that we get from the zero effect vision from the US. We've had many different perspectives also from other departments and security departments from all over the world, going from UK, even Belgium, Germany now, and all have different views on this. So what's your, let's say, five-second appreciation about all of this? That's of course a good reason why you're here.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity of sharing that. What we observe so far is a risk of fragmentation of security requirements. The European Commission rely on the governments in order to undertake the adequate security measures. You saw the strategic measures, you saw the technical measures, and what we would like is an homogeneity across Europe, but also, if possible, outside Europe, of what are the 5G security standards that are applicable not only to the vendors, but also to the system, the stakeholders of the 5G ecosystem. So that is the first element. The second element is that the efforts that Huawei shows to the industry is an example. And it should be considered as an example, not only on transparency, but also on the easiness and the maturity with which Huawei voluntarily disclose vulnerabilities, fixes vulnerabilities, open the doors to pen testing. And I think it's a way, regardless of the geopolitics dimension of all of this, it's a way to contribute very significantly to the trust of the ecosystem of 5G. And as such, I completely acknowledge Huawei efforts. And for the record, Huawei was one of the first telecom vendors to establish their CERT activity together with Orange, and as such, it triggered quite a shift in the way the equipment vendors collaborated.
Well, thanks for sharing that view. So it's not only a showcase of practice, but apparently also of good practice. So thanks for sharing your opinion there, Francois. I assume that you're not one of those employees which is shareholder of Huawei today. So I assume that you don't have any vested interest here.
No, not at all. But just it really is a chance to have that level of cooperation, and definitely, of course, Huawei now is not the only one to cooperate at this level of intensity. All the European and other Chinese partners are there and they are completely aware of the stakes there. We need to make 5G a digital trusted world. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so you can stick around still. If you have to go, then please don't be locked into this. I'll just continue with now putting Koen a little bit more for the next 10 minutes on the barbecue. Try to fry him a little bit more. Koen, Francois mentioned something very interesting there, and that is really the and I still hear the birds whistling in his garden. That's quite interesting. So the interesting thing that Francois mentioned, I don't think I've seen actually as part of your presentation, or maybe I missed it, is the reaction time when it comes to vulnerabilities found. So responsible disclosure. What if vulnerabilities are being found? What is the committed reaction time from Huawei on these, and how are you reacting? So yes, there's a search activity which is definitely fine, but there's also of course the other types of ingredients. So how are you thinking on those types of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. The P-cert, I think Francois already alluded to it, is critical also in our whole product development lifecycle. That's the last part of it, and we do have have established secure connections between our P-cert and our customers' C-cert across the world for the big customers, like for example Orange. Where we notify our customers of any type of vulnerability as soon as we have discovered it. So there's two types of notifications. First of all, you have a notification before we actually have a patch. We do that in full trust and over secured connections, because our customers need to know that immediately when anything comes to light. Secondly, and we'll try to discuss with them and go in dialogue with them as to how they can mitigate it. And then obviously patches are coming out as fast as possible. As fast as possible, I can't give you a specific SLA, because that SLA depends or varies based upon the criticality of that vulnerability. If those are really bad, really high-level vulnerabilities, they'll be patched within a day. I mean, and there's others that may be a little bit lower vulnerability. They've got a bit lower in the cuteness, maybe not 1 day. But we do commit to actually address vulnerabilities in a very expedient way. And we have set up secure communications channels with all our carrier customers. I think, and that's across industry, for carriers, we obviously don't advertise these vulnerabilities in IT type platforms, but we do have our communications with all the affected customers of those vulnerabilities.
Right. Yeah, I think to some extent that's of course makes sense. However, the proof of the pudding is usually in the eating, and so I think here as well the question is how is it being managed internally? Can you give a bit of an idea on, for instance, the sizes or the types of people working on the products when it comes to cybersecurity? Do you have specific cybersecurity product management active on this?
Absolutely.
And yeah, so in that respect, so I'm trying to figure out on how practical we can see this, and maybe also setting a bit of a scene towards the rest of the industry, because I think there's other industries that can definitely learn from this, both in terms of zero trust architecture and perspectives, as well as on the reaction times.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of levels here. First of all, in terms of the overall number of employees that are dedicated to security, I think it borders, it's close to 2,000 people. So it's quite a lot of people. So let me explain where they are being placed relevant to this discussion. First of all, in our product lines, so the people that are in our product lines, we have a lot of security professionals. All the developers, by the way, have to undergo security training to different levels based upon if they're a junior developer or if they're a committer who's actually reviewing the code. So there's different levels of security training. There's a lot of security activities that are actually being implemented throughout the product development lifecycle, over 70 different activities actually at this moment. And that pertains from threat modeling all the way towards vulnerability management. Threat modeling initially, obviously, and then secure coding, testing, and all the way up to vulnerability management. Now, that's one part, and we have a very extensive P-cert department that actually goes to the conferences, has the interactions with the customers to gather all the potential news about vulnerabilities. They also do internal testing. And then we have an additional internal, we call it an independent cybersecurity lab, but it's actually an independent from the product lines. That's it's a department of over 200 pen testing engineers that will test all the products, major versions of the product that come out of the product line. They will test that. They will try to rip it apart and try to find any remaining vulnerabilities. So that's a department of over 200 pen testing engineers that are constantly doing that. And then aside from that, we are still offering our stakeholders to do the testing themselves. And that's why we have set up 6 security evaluation centers across the world, where we actually allow the people or allow our stakeholders to verify the security of our products up till the source code. So they can check, just much like ERNW has done. They can check the maturity, the security maturity of our source code. So if you take all these together, then we believe that this is a very, we call it the many hands, many eyes approach, but it gives you a very solid assurance of the security of those products. And we feel that once they come out, and I'm certain that there's a lot of agencies outside of Huawei and outside of our ecosystem that are also looking for vulnerabilities, and we still maintain very good cybersecurity records. So we feel that once all our products have undergone all these activities, they come out and they're being released in a very fairly battle-hardened way, because they have been tested thoroughly before they reach the markets.
Right, thanks. And yeah, I think that is a very solid approach, without a doubt. I think there's maybe the piece missing where you might also hire in external experts to do something similar. That could actually assist in your team's efforts, but having already a team of 200 cybersecurity pen testers and engineers scrutinizing the product is, of course, something great. Of course,
maybe to add to that, Ulrich, because we do. I want to make that point that we do invite, and ERNW is a great example. We do invite external companies to actually do the testing after we have done the testing internally. So that's that third layer. So just wanted to add that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, and I think as I was saying, sometimes it's also the case that in competitions. We'll actually have a webinar on this in a couple of weeks' time. There are hacker competitions, of course, finding vulnerabilities, and so those types of things you can also obviously subscribe to. Not that I'm advertising that service in any way or shape or form, but it actually helps. I mean, trying to find also the community of hackers there that is capable of finding additional vulnerabilities, and then is also capable of saying, okay, yes, we endorse that this is actually a good product and it makes sense. There's another concept that I would like to share with you, and I'm actually going to share my screen here. Those of you who have participated in the discussions that we have on Tuesday noon have seen a couple of these things. This is a concept which is called software bill of materials. And so I'm wondering how open Huawei is in actually sharing its perspective in terms of the bill of materials. So you talked about zero trust. To many people in the industry, trust has to do with transparency, and how open and transparent can you be on all of the different components that are part of the product in this case that you have to offer. Of course, we know, I mean, parts of the product are obviously related to confidentiality and to industrial proprietary information, so intellectual property. But if you take the example, for instance, here of a car is consisting out of many different components, and we usually don't even know where these components are coming from. So the same is something that we can still see happening in the development world of cybersecurity by design, which is, I think, something that you are promoting to some extent as well. And so is this something that that Huawei would be considering in such an environment, that you would be providing transparency in the bill of materials?
Absolutely, and I think the centers and the work that, for example, I'm referring to it again, but for example, ERNW has done is a perfect testimony to that. We're opening up our products all the way up to the source code, which is obviously very, very proprietary. We do it in an immensely secured way, so under NDA, and obviously this is in a strictly controlled fashion. But we try to be as transparent as possible because we are very confident that our products have been built in a solid way, and we would love for more stakeholders to actually attest to that or assure themselves of that security. So for that, we're trying to provide the ultimate transparency in terms of giving any type of security consultancy access to our source code in a secured fashion, obviously, in order to make their evaluations and to assure themselves of the security in all these different security software components.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Let me share another one with you just before we kick it off. Let's say for the rest of the morning, and that is basically the thing that Francois was mentioning as well. Is the zero trust in this case needs to really come from the whole value chain, and I think this is also something that we are considering from our perspective. So you have to consider the supply chain risk as a total environment. Now, here the challenge is how do you manage that, and I think there's also a major role, of course, not only from the vendor perspective, also from the operator, also from the member states. But somebody really has to manage this the supply chain. So I haven't seen any activities yet. Like in this case, it's the Atlantic Council that takes the front runner stage on bringing together a number of entities under that consideration of we want to make sure that we can maintain and relate to the whole value chain. So part of it has to do with the CERT activities, with the investigations. But also parts of it has to do, of course, with not specific incident related, but just the overall perspective, making sure that that you can find and continue on the whole food chain, as we can say, providing transparency, providing also a trail of different things that have happened. So I think many of those things are obviously in the thinking, in development. It's not that this has been proven in any way or shape or form in any big industry up until now. So we see it also as an evolution, but it's something that's happening in many different evolutions. So that in any case, and I see that some people are actually already asking about my slides as well. So I'll add them to the rest of the table and make sure that you guys can get them as well. So what's maybe as a final question to you, Koen, what's your perspective on the future, and how would you see this further developing in the future? And how can we continue with this open and transparent discussion, of course?
By collaborating and by I think one of the most important slides that I showed was the slides of shared responsibility. 5G is promising a lot in terms of evolutions and in terms of the future, what all the capabilities that will be unlocked. However, in order to, it obviously has also immense security implications because everything gets connected right now. But that's all the more reason why we should actually then work together towards a 5G ecosystem that is made in a secure fashion and try to be as transparent as possible. All the players alike try to be as transparent as possible and come up with a set of unified, concrete requirements based upon very specific facts, fact-based, if evidence, certifications, all these things we very much welcome and recommend, and we very much try to adhere to, because that takes a lot of the political and a lot of the economical discussions outside of that equation. We're cybersecurity professionals. We talk about cybersecurity, and that's what we're trying to assure our customers that we're doing, that we're having a decent approach. However, we can always learn, and that's why we need to do this all together to come up to ever improve that security.
Right, and that's of course also why we have conversations like this. And I just pulled up your slide again on the shared responsibility. I think it's definitely important. Also, maybe a suggestion from our side, being also discussing about these things in many different ways. For instance, also with governments, with entities when it comes to security controls. And I think that's maybe an additional component that you can consider here is how can you provide not only a transparency body, but maybe also a controlling body as we would be looking forward to working with security as in physical security, as in law enforcement, as in controlling entities. And I think sometimes there, of course, the relation to China is might be blurring a bit because that's probably not where we from the West feel that there is that much transparency happening. But in any case, I think we can continue for this for likely another hour, Koen.
Absolutely.
And especially also maybe opening up a debate in the next future on the US versus Cybersecurity Transparency Center discussion. But let's finalize here. I'm going to share a couple of final thoughts on my side for all of those of you who have participated in this morning session, and that's really my short additional elevator pitches, if you like, in terms of our next sessions. Because after this one, we actually will be having at noon an interesting session as well, which is basically an additional streaming of some activities that are happening in the world of the industrial transformation, digital transformation through our partners of ARC. So normally we have our network and information security activities at noon. And so that will happen today as well, but in this case, it will be co-hosted with ARC. So as of noon, we'll be opening up this session, but the session only starts at 1 p.m. And we have a couple of interesting thoughts coming directly from the ARC forum that is taking place 3 days, started yesterday and continuing until Monday afternoon. So we'll be focusing a bit on that this afternoon. Going further, next week, we'll have also in the network and information security activities, namely the cybersecurity for industry activities at noon on Tuesdays. We'll be talking about IoT, industrial IoT, and then the Azure Sentinel domain from Microsoft. I think two very important developments happening within Microsoft, understanding or trying to understand Microsoft's view on industrial cybersecurity. The week afterwards, we'll be talking about ransomware, specifically industrial networks. And then on going further, we'll be hopefully working with Nozomi on how industrial networks are being deployed today when it comes to security. And I'm focusing further along on how we can harden industrial cybersecurity systems in those ways. This Thursday, we won't have any identity and access management, neither GDPR sessions, but then next week we'll continue with those together with ForgeRock, and we'll have our GDPR salon online. And then for next Tuesday, we'll continue our cybersecurity experts from home. Next week will be, can the real AI please stand up? It might be an exclamation mark. It could also be a question mark. Here we have one of the experts who's been working on this domain for actually many years. G-Data, Ralf Bensmuller, is the head of the research groups there and has been working with AI technologies already for some time. And so here we'll be looking on how AI is being applied into cybersecurity and how we can actually learn from those experiences. And then June 2nd, hopefully Koen will be seeing you again on 5G security use cases and how 5G can trigger new businesses and new opportunities. So with this, I say, of course, a whole full agenda with other activities, but thank you very much to all of you for joining. And definitely thanks to you, Koen, and to Francois, who already left the building. So have a nice continuation of the morning. Best to your colleagues, and do make sure that our 5G is cyber secure. We count on you and your teams for this.
Thanks.
Have a nice further morning, and hope to see you
have a great one.
soon later on. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.